Hey there, guys. Welcome to another episode of Let's Shop, a show where I, Hamilton Klein, am going to try and walk you through some stuff about Photoshop. Today we're going to be talking about smart objects. Smart objects are something that is totally amazing and that you should totally be using and you probably don't use enough. Now, for the most part, smart objects happen in the layers panel. Let's talk about layers for a second. Right now I've got a background layer. That's a special kind of layer. I can make another kind of layer by clicking the new layer button, and that makes a new layer. There's also this little guy right here that allows me to create lots of special kinds of layers that sort of add a really specific set of colors or adjustments. For instance, I can add a solid color layer. There we go. That's nice. Nice solid color layer. I can also add a gradient layer. Look at that. Isn't that nice? Gradient layer. Now that one probably isn't very useful. Hold on, let me get a different gradient. There we go. Yeah, gradient layer. Nice. I can also do a pattern layer. Look at that. That looks horrible. Oh, wow. Okay. There we go. These different kinds of special layers all have their own special settings. And the difference between these is that if I make a new layer right now and I use Alt or Option backspace, I can fill that layer with a color like red. However, that layer is now full of red pixels, as opposed to this fill layer over here, which actually has a red color setting to the layer, as opposed to a bunch of red pixels. It basically says all my pixels are red. And there's a subtle difference to that. In layer 1 here, the pixels all say I am red, whereas in color fill 1 here, the layer itself says all my pixels are red, and that's the difference, okay? When it comes to smart objects, basically what happens is, let's take a brush and let's just draw something on the screen. Hooray! Yay! Oh, that's a nice drawing. Good drawing, Hamilton. Great job. If I have this drawing on the screen and I use Control or Command T to transform my layer, and I hold down Option or Alt and Shift, I can resize that layer very, very small. And when I commit that change, that layer is now very, very small. If I now hold down Control and T to transform again, and then hold down Option and Shift to make it big again, you can see that now it's lost all of its clarity. Pixel layers can be resampled using sizing from the transform tool, but when they get sampled down, they lose any of their original fidelity. So that doesn't seem like a very good option for us. So what we'd rather do is we'd rather be able to change its size, rotate it, and then perhaps always get it back to what it was. And that's where smart layers come in, especially smart object layers. Now, in Photoshop, when you right-click a layer, there's a whole bunch of options. Sometimes too many options, and people get scared of it. But one of those options here is Convert to Smart Object, and that's what we're going to do. Click Convert to Smart Object after right-clicking on the layer. And now this layer is a smart object, and you can see that because there's a little icon in the thumbnail of the layer. Now at this point, if I Control T and I transform this layer down really, really small, it transforms down just like it did before. But now, if I Control T and transform up, it retains the original size and fidelity that it had before. Now the reason for that is because what a smart object is essentially another Photoshop file inside of your Photoshop file. Or more specifically, when you create a smart object is created as a Photoshop file inside of your Photoshop file. This layer is now like another Photoshop file. In fact, if you double click on this thumbnail right here, it will actually open up a file called a PSB. Now, however, this file is just a temporary file to represent the data of this layer. But what it shows is that actually, if you were to import a layer onto this canvas, it would create it as a smart object, or at least it would give you the option to. Now, over here in this smart object right here, this is the smart object information of the layer in my other document. So I have a Let's Shop document, and then I have this layer 2 PSB. And if I grab my brush here, inside of the PSB, I can add a new layer, switch my color, and draw on here. Nothing is going to happen immediately over on my actual document until I save. And if I save right now, you can see that instantly the data that I added into the layer 2 is now added into the original Photoshop document. Now what's even better is if I take this layer and I transform it again, and I hold down Control while I'm transforming a corner, I can skew this layer into something a little bit more interesting. Now at this point, I have skewed the layer, but it is still linked to the data from this layer2.psb. And in fact, if I now move some of this data around and resave it, you can see that that data moves around even inside of the skewed layer. So smart objects are a way of being able to retain the original information of layers, files, or anything like that, while still being able to skew and stretch and rotate them with the regular Photoshop tools. Now the difference is that smart objects are not regular pixel layers. In fact, if I grab my brush right now, you can see that the layer doesn't even want me to draw on it. In fact, if I try to draw on it, it says, do you want to rasterize? Now, what is raster? Well, raster images are essentially bitmap images. They are dumb pixels as opposed to smart maths or smart vectors. Okay, rasterizing a smart layer essentially turns it into dumb pixels. And I don't think that's really what I want to do right now. I want to keep this a smart object. However, I can't draw on it. The only way I could add information to this is to double click inside of it and add information into the actual PSB data. Or I'd have to add a new layer on top of that layer. So, smart objects are essentially Photoshop's way of handling data without actually destroying any of the original data. You're essentially seeing a representation of that original layer's document. Smart objects are even better than that, though. For instance, let's say that I duplicate this layer by holding down Option or Alt and dragging it slightly into a new position on the layer panel. I now have two objects based on the same layer. And I'm going to take one of these and transform it very small. And I'm going to take another one and I am going to rotate it around. Now, if I double click into one of these smart objects, you can see that this one double clicked into layer2.psb. It's still in its original orientation. You guys, if I add a new layer on here and I draw in with another color, you're going to see that after I save it, both of those layers panels, both of those smart objects were linked to the exact same file. And when I updated that file, both of them updated. So smart objects not only give you the ability to transform something with its original data, but it also allows you to transform lots of different things. This is especially nice when you're a designer and you need to design a bunch of buttons or something like that, and you need to have a bunch of things on screen that are all essentially designed the exact same way, and if you want to update one, you can update all of the others. Now, that's not even barely scratching the surface of what smart objects can do. One of the more interesting aspects of smart objects is actually the fact that they can have what's known as smart filters. For instance, right now, I'm going to select this layer 2 copy. I'm going to say filter, and I'm going to say blur, and I'm going to use a Gaussian blur. And when I do, I'm going to push that blur up just a little bit. There we go. Nice big blur right there. And what you can see is over in the layer panel, instead of just flattening a blur onto that pixel layer, because it is a smart layer, it is able to handle a smart blur. And what's really great about this is that just means I can turn the blur on and off, but I can do so much more. For instance, I can actually change that blur. If I double click on the blur, I can now change it to whatever I actually need it to be if I didn't do it right the first time. What's even kind of more interesting though is this little button right over here to the right of Gaussian blur. This is actually the blending options of the effect that I just put onto this layer, the blur. One of the things I can do is I can just reduce the opacity of the blur. What that ends up doing is it ends up saying, well, the blur is slightly transparent, but the original information is still solid. So if I were to reduce that, you can see that it's actually blurring out somewhat, but only barely. And even more interesting is something like coming up here and changing the blend mode. For instance, I could do something like an overlay. And no, overlay wasn't interesting. How about let's try darken. You can see now that this is almost creating a drop shadow effect on the different sections of this object. And it is also blurring out everything on the back. So when you have a smart filter on a smart object, you can continue to edit that filter in ways that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise on a regular pixel layer. And of course, like I said, you can also just turn them on and off to see what they look like. Smart objects are fantastic, and they're definitely something that you should add into your repertoire. And a number of people ask me, well, when should I do a smart object? The answer to that is probably just about always, especially if you're about to edit a pixel layer with transforms or with filters. If you're about to do a filter or a transform, you definitely want to turn that layer into a smart object before you do it. This has been a short introduction into smart objects in Photoshop. I'm sure I'll do more videos about smart objects as we move forward with this new video series. But for right now, this is something that you should look into and learn a little bit more about. There is a lot more to learn about smart objects before you're done. Thanks for watching the video, and I'm sure I'll be doing more. See you in the next one.